Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Triveni Dialogue, the second of the Triveni Dialogue, hosted by Institute for Australia-India Engagement, Australia-India Business Council, and the Center for India-Australia Studies at Jindal Global University in India. As you know, Triveni comes from tri-junction of three rivers. This is in India. And these three institutions are bringing a variety of perspectives on mutually beneficial and interesting topics from here on. And that's why we call it the Triveni Dialogue. Today, we have got sports persons, sports stars, officials, trainers, business leaders, sporting codes, including IPL, and several league officials participating with us. Why? Because sport is a way of life in many countries, especially in Australia. It is a major contributor to economic and well-being. And if you count the not-for-profit related activities as well, it constitutes around 2% of the Australian GDP. 90% of the adults here have an interest in sports. 8.4 million adults and 3 million children every year participate in sporting activities. The sector itself employs around 60,000 people directly. The government of Australia had allocated around $390 million in 2019-20 to the sports sector. And globally, sport amounts to around $756 billion. So you can understand the closure and impairment of facilities and sporting activities has hit everyone hard, not to mention the Sochi Olympics. Entire ecosystem is in shock. Players, coaches, trainers, boards, federations, businesses, you name it. In India, too, the sporting sector touches around $1 billion, which is also badly battered by COVID-19 as the numbers continue to rise there. Prime Minister Modi had come to Australia in 2014 and described Australia as one of the global leaders in sport. And as Australia limps back to normalcy and it picks up sporting activities again, the world is looking at Australia, and so is India, to learn from the lessons that we can draw from Australia's experience in reopening of the sector. So ladies and gentlemen, to discuss some of these topics, it is my profound pleasure to invite Mr. Shaun Star, our moderator for this event. Shaun is an associate professor and associate dean and executive director of Center for India-Australia Studies at OP Jindal Global University in India. He's more of a local now in India, I must say, because he's been there since 2010. He runs his own advisory practice and has advised numerous organizations with their entry and expansion into India, and advised a number of clients in the field of sports law, including sporting federations, including Afghanistan Cricket Board. Shaun is an Australian qualified lawyer and recently was named as one of the 30 people to watch in business of law in Asia. At Jindal Global Law School in India, Shaun teaches sports law, governance, and tort law. He has worked as senior operation manager of the Indian Premier League as well. He has published a book entitled Australia in India, a comparative overview of the law and legal practice. He is also the co-founder of Chair of Australia-India Youth Dialogue, a forum which hosts young politicians, entrepreneurs, policymakers, diplomats, and encourages collaboration between the two countries. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Mr. Shaun Star.
Thank you, Ashutosh, for that very warm welcome. And I echo your thoughts on what a great privilege it is to work with your institute and the Australia-India Business Council in bringing to a wider audience these very important and topical issues as part of the Triveni Dialogue. As you discussed, the coronavirus has impacted us all personally and professionally. And sport has been no exception. Indeed, the sport industry has been one of the harder hit industries. And we've got some fantastic speakers lined up for everyone today to talk about that impact and potentially the way forward as well. I want to also echo your thoughts on how great it is to have people on the call from all over the world. In fact, there's about, I think, 4 continents represented on this call, despite the time zones that people are grappling with. Some people are in the middle of the night. Some people, I know a lot from India, have just woken up. So we thank you for tuning in. And it's also great to see students from Jindal Global University, Indian Institute of Management, and a number of other universities tuning in for this session as well. So thank you for joining. I want to start, in the interest of time, by introducing our first distinguished speaker, and that is Matthew Hayden. So I'll unmute you, Matthew, but I'll give you a brief introduction first. So I mean, probably, Matthew really doesn't need an introduction to many of us on the call, particularly due to his cricketing exploits. And as I alluded to before, Matthew, is obviously in international cricket, has represented Australia for many, many years. And for many of the Indian members of the audience who have dialed in might fondly or not so fondly remember Matthew's exploit in India, I think in 2001, where you averaged, Matthew, more than 100 in that series, scoring 549 runs. So perhaps that's where your love affair with India started. I'm not sure. You can shed some light on that. But certainly subsequently, I mean, on the field, we know Matthew has played more than 100 tests for Australia, scoring more than 8,000 runs and 30 centuries. And that doesn't even sort of encompass the magical one-day international record as well. But off the field, Matthew has been a commentator in the Indian Premier League for many years, and that's after a fantastic career on the field in the Indian Premier League. In fact, I think in the second season of the IPL was the leading run scorer in the 2009 season, getting the orange cap by the end of the season. And as I've said, that love affair with India has continued both on and off the field. Currently, Matthew is the ambassador, the Goodwill ambassador for the Institute of Australia-India Engagement, and sits on the board of the Institute as well. Matthew also has been involved in a number of philanthropic and charitable efforts through his management company, the Hayden Way. I will let Matthew take the floor now, because it'll be great to hear from you, Matthew, in terms of what you think the impact from an athlete's perspective and someone who's served on boards like Cricket Australia and like in Queensland, the impact of the coronavirus on sport and particularly on cricket, and also maybe shed some light on the importance of sport, particularly cricket, in relationships such as the Australia-India relationship. I'll hand it over to you now, Matthew.
Thank you, Shaun, and good evening or good morning, wherever you are on the planet. Can you believe what we are doing during this period? And I want to talk to that point as well. You'll have to forgive me because I'm driving, and coincidentally, I'm driving with a colleague from Haryana, who's sending his best to that region of the world as well, famous Punjab. And we were just having a debate whether or not he was Australian or Indian, or whether or not I was Indian and Australian as well. So we both agreed to disagree that he's Indian and I'm Australian, but we can count our blessings because we consider ourselves to be both. Fortunately, Indian Australian or Australian Indian. Look, I wanted to talk to at first around two blessings during COVID period. Is it a blessing in disguise, or are we counting our blessings? And I think during this period, it's been a solid mixture of both. If I can talk to the counting our blessings, I think this period has sharpened our focus. When you talk of athletic ability, or ability in anything in life, to be able to focus and concentrate and progress, to get a better outcome. Your visions and identity and purpose need to be enhanced. You don't, for example, face a cricket ball with your eyes closed, coming at 160 kilometers an hour. So I suspect that a lot of us have sharpened our focus. It's opened up endless opportunities, boundless opportunities to be able to communicate. It's been an enormous cost saving in doing so. Generally speaking, we would have this sort of forum where physically we'd need to be together, but we're finding new ways to be able to participate, to search for outcomes without the financial restraints of having to travel or go to different places. I'm not saying that physical contact is not a huge part of it, but of course it is. But I mean, in that way, our focus has been very centered around improving our communication during this period without the effects of too many other influences. I was talking to my dear friend Justin Langer, coach of the Australian cricket team yesterday, for over an hour. And I was asking him, what it meant during his time as taking over from Sandpaper Gate, and now during this COVID stage. And he was defining it in terms of the two separate areas that he played in, the non-professional era and the semi-professional era, and how that impacted on just purely from a HR point of view. He pointed out the fact that when we first started touring for Australia together, there was a coach, a physiotherapist, and a manager. And the manager was often someone from the board of Cricket Australia who represented the board and would report back on all issues both on and off the field. But it was a simple party of three. Now, on the latest tour that I saw where Australia visited India, there was a representative or a staff member per player. It was a 1-to-1 ratio. So during this time when Cricket Australia has been, going through some really difficult times, he spoke a lot about the fact that his focus now is on those things that are super important to him. So no longer will there be such an enormous entourage of people that travel. The organisation will have cut its costs. In many ways, he described it like a duck on the water. When you study a duck on the water, they look so graceful, don't they, as they go across the top, but you forget just how hard they're paddling underneath. And I think organisations are very much like that at the moment. It's been, a lot more work underneath the surface of the movement still continuing. I believe the Australian cricket, the Indian cricket tour has been confirmed at this stage. But I'd imagine both organisations are paddling hard underneath, to make sure that can happen. And then I want to talk to the second point around, is it a blessing in disguise or do we count our blessings? So I think in many ways, blessings in disguise is very much a part of our daily life. I know from a family perspective, COVID, has made me dig a little deeper, be a lot more present. I think it's almost like a stitch in time saves nine. And I've been a lot more connected to the people that I love, the people that I trust and respect and admire, and to those organisations which I feel are doing, fantastic work, right across Australia, including the ones that we're talking of today. So, counting your blessings, I think, is such a huge part of our life, and, something that I'm really honoured to have that opportunity to share with you today around the relationship and the importance of India, Australia. And I describe it a lot like I don't know if anyone is a fisherman or loves to be on the water, but if you're, just excuse me 1 second, I'll just, mate. Thank you, mate.
Thank you, mate.
Have a good day. Excuse me 1 sec. Those of you who are fishermen or boaties, when you're on the water at night, it's really scary. But there's one thing that actually is the most important in order for you to get a great night's sleep. There's one thing that's really important at night on the sea, and that is that you have to have a solid anchor. You have to know that where your position is at time of rest in the ink blacker night around the ocean, and it's a big place, scary place, you have to know what that anchor is doing and whether it's solid or not. And I think during COVID-19, what it's actually done in terms of the relationship is it's thrown this anchor out there. And those anchors are your values. Those anchors are the thing that connect you. And India, Australia, one of the great connectors is obviously started with sport, or not started with sport, but certainly has contributed to this fantastic relationship. It's like a conversation starter, isn't it? It opens up and it flourishes from who's doing what with the bat and ball in hand to guys, we really need to understand each other a lot better. We need to culturally dig a lot deeper to understand the kind of influences of our life, not just on a personal note, but also from a sense of developing a structure of change. Mahatma Gandhi said that if first you want to change the world, you need to change yourself. So again, this anchor that cricket has been to the relationship to India and Australia is a significant conversation starter. It goes into the culture of sport itself, which is, in this country, very much around give a man a fair go, play hard, but play fair. Understand that vilification is not acceptable. Race, religion, creed or colour, nothing is worth vilifying anyone. And during COVID, I think we've found that there has been such a deep sense of understanding. I know that my friends in Chennai are doing it a lot tougher than what we are here in Australia. I think some have been in their rooms for over 70 days, confined to isolation. I know Mumbai as well has been, very heavily affected. So cricket is, again, that thread that keeps us in the loop with each other. And if we're counting our blessings again, the one beautiful thing about cricket is that there's a deep archive of events. And so whilst we haven't been in a situation where we've seen live sport, we've been able to dig back into those treasured memories, sometimes those childhood memories. I saw a match the other day of Alan Border at the Ashes. The very first time that in his regime, he took back the Ashes in '89, and it suffered such heavy defeats through the early '80s and came back in '89 to set up really what was almost three decades of magnificent cricket for Australia. Starting at that point, starting with a titular head, someone like Alan Border. So these threads and these anchors are so important, and I don't want to talk too long, but I'm blessed, and I've been counting my blessings. I'm blessed to be able to have an audience today and a forum in which I can speak and observe and understand and learn more with a natural curiosity around the deep-seated relationship that we have, bilateral relationship that we have with India. And our cultures now are starting to emerge amongst the great debates of strategy. And in particular, as we understand the conflicts that are happening with most nations around the world with China, how do we deepen and secure greater energy within an economic sense? How do we secure and develop and emerge as better people post-COVID and deeply routed in these anchors that one must need in their own life and one must need to develop these terrific relationships across our borders. Just in closing, the one thing that connects us all is the sea. So for mine, our deep love of, and my personal deep love of the ocean is something that, connects us, and we're almost now through just a heightened awareness of our own individuality, but also our focus, deep-seated focus on strategic relationships. We're all connected, and that connection is such a blessing in itself. Thank you. I look forward to hearing some of the other speakers today. It's my great privilege to be able to share some time with you. And God bless everyone. Stay safe and stay happy. Thank you, Shaun.
Thanks, Matthew. And thank you for those personal insights as well as your professional insights. And I'm sure that sort of resonates with a lot of us here on the call as well. So thank you very much for that. And I will now hand the baton over to our next speaker, which is going to be Dr. Sarah Kelly. But before I do that, I will give you a brief introduction, Sarah. So Sarah works at the University of Queensland. She's an associate professor in both the law school and the business school, got affiliations with both. And she's the marketing discipline leader and director of external engagement at the business school at the University of Queensland, and has a broad range of research interests, many of which are centered in the field of sports, including in esports, including in scandals in sport and governance in sport, and the list goes on. So Sarah will shed some light on that shortly. She's also the lead of an interdisciplinary group called Trust, Ethics and Governance at the University of Queensland, and also a visiting fellow at Loughborough University in London. Apart from her academic record, Sarah is on a number of boards and been quite active in sports governance. Particularly right now, is she's deputy chair of the Brisbane Lions, which is an Australian Football League club, obviously based in Brisbane, on a number of other boards, including Tourism and Events Queensland, and the list goes on. Sarah has also had strong ties with India. She's visited, for example, Jindal Global University a number of times, leading delegations of MBA students as well as law students. With the latter, those students have been on immersion programs learning about sports law and governance throughout India and the world. And they've certainly helped bolster Australia-India ties in the sports governance space, as well as people-to-people links in the Australia-India space as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Sarah, now, and perhaps we'll take a sort of a business focus to start with, and maybe if you could shed some light on the business impact of coronavirus on sport, and in particular, how well have the business models shaped up? I mean, we know from a business model perspective that a lot of traditional sports are very heavily reliant on revenues from broadcasting. Obviously, there hasn't been a lot of sport played, so how heavy has that hit been? Will this require sports and federations to rethink how they monetize their properties, how they monetize their leagues, and what place does innovation have in all of this post-COVID-19?
Thanks very much, Shaun, for that very generous introduction and for having me on this very esteemed panel. I really enjoyed hearing what Matthew had to say. I could have listened to him all day. Matthew, really, really interesting insights there from the athlete and administrator's point of view. I thank you for that. Yeah, look, it's I'm an optimist like Matthew. Sports around the world obviously have been severely impacted in their business models by this pandemic, by this crisis. But at the same time, we're seeing, different responses, different levels of resilience according to particular business models that sports adopt around the world, which I've found interesting to look at and monitor as we're now reaching a kind of a COVID recovery and looking forward to a post-COVID sporting environment, whatever that might look like. So I think that's one point to note. It's really worth examining which business models are more resilient in sport in these times. Any economist, any business strategist, anyone in society now will say there will be more crises, whether it's related to climate change disasters, whether it's related to more pandemics, terrorism and other security issues. Whatever it is, we need to be more prepared. That's one thing this particular practice run has taught us all, regardless of what sector you're in. So, from an India-Australia bilateral relations point of view, obviously, as Matthew's mentioned, and you yourself as well, Shaun, has mentioned, sport is a huge unifier for us. And globally, it's a universal language. It's one of the reasons I'm entrenched in it as a researcher and a consultant speaker. I really love sport for that reason. Everyone understands it. Everyone relates to it at some level. The other thing I think that ties, going back to what Matthew said about the need to focus on the economic side to the bilateral relationship between Australia and India, I think something that really binds us is innovation. Both countries are very, very good at it, historically, now, and going forward. And innovation is something I think that sport is really good at picking up. Probably hasn't been historically, but certainly is during this pandemic. We've seen so much agility across sports around the world in completely refocusing on their business models. And currently many discussions around that and experiments happening, which is obviously a sign of effective innovation. You need to experiment to learn what models will work and what won't. We've seen that certainly in Australia. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it in America. The big global sports of, you know, the EPL, the NBA, the NFL in America as well. You know, how solving big problems that they're now facing. How do you engage fans and sponsors virtually? How do you activate sponsorships virtually and hang on to sponsors, which represent a significant amount of income for professional sports and trickle-down effects to our grassroots sports and sports development? How do you now have contactless stadia around the world and smarter stadia to facilitate this sort of technology, which does exist, but unfortunately a lot of sporting infrastructure is dated, and so we need to look at that. How can we solve that problem? Because that problem is here to stay. Definitely there will be people and a complete change in fan behaviour and people attending any live events for that matter around the need for a contactless service and experience. So there's that aspect as well. And then, of course, you've mentioned, Shaun, the need to diversify revenues or unlock IP that sport might be sitting on that hasn't been unlocked previously. So we've seen it already in some of the sports here in Australia, but also particularly, I would say, the NBA is one of the leaders in diversification into simulated sports and esports as one example of finding a new way to monetize sport. This has been really successful. The Formula One was an excellent example. They've been particularly agile during this pandemic as an example with the e-racing and the Formula One going virtual. I've seen some of the feedback from the fans and studies done on that. What did the Formula One fans think of that, of a simulated sport as opposed to the real thing? And by and large, they've really enjoyed it, but it hasn't quite met what live sport gives you. And some of the real experts, I'm no expert in Formula One, but apparently one of the really enjoyable aspects of that sport to monitor is the pit stop and the team, watching the team at close range and timing in their reaction to changing tyres, changing oil, all those things they need to do, and watching that teamwork at close range. The simulated sports just don't do that. So there's parts of the sport, and going back, I think, to what one of the key points Matthew raised as well, around having an anchor, having you know, symbols that are so critical in sport and traditions in sport. We must hold on to those. They're some of the things that keep the fans, the sponsors, and the broader community so engaged with sport. So we have to figure out a way to, you know, integrate a nod to nostalgia and history and tradition, but also embrace the future and the technologies that are available. And so I think we're going to see post-COVID a much more rapid adoption by sports around the world in solving these problems I've just raised, using AR, augmented reality, using VR, virtual reality, using holograms to provide a even more exciting and engaging live and virtual experience. Providing both of those is so important, because from how you might strategize around this is you might see two segments emerging post-COVID. Some will be willing to take the risk of attending crowded events if there is no vaccine in the next couple of years, say. And they'll be obviously younger, less vulnerable, or those who have had the virus potentially. And those who are more vulnerable, who will self-isolate or avoid crowded events and want to maintain that social distancing. So sports will need to serve both of those fan segments, and sponsors will need to activate to both of those fan segments. So the virtual is here to stay. And it's also a great way, we're talking about the new revenues, it's a great way to leverage a trend in sport, which is before COVID, displaced fandom. So fans existing geographically disparately from the sports brand or team, which are usually quite regionally based around the world. You know, FC Barcelona is a great example of that. There's more fans outside of Barcelona than in Barcelona. So the virtual, again, some great technology to leverage to make that happen. I think next year's Olympics will be a great moment for global sport to come together, to regroup after this terrible crisis, which is still underway, obviously, in Japan. But at least it'll be a chance to showcase some of these technologies and how we can engage virtual fans. At this point, I guess we don't know the level of social distancing and COVID restrictions that will apply to that event. but it will be a great opportunity to really showcase what is available and what we can enjoy remotely. And I've seen some of in these startups and accelerators that I'm involved in, we've certainly seen the use of augmented reality and holograms used so well to engage not only fans in the stadium, but also outside. So, you know, it's potentially you could even go to a local stadium and witness a significant world sports event in that stadium with augmented reality and hologram usage, virtual reality even. So I think, but create that live atmosphere at the same time. So there's a lot of blue sky thinking in sport right now, which I find exciting and I find optimistic post-COVID. When we look at some of the resilience factors, the actual business models that sports subscribe to, in Australia, of course, and India, well, actually India is a bit of a mixed model, but there's a lot of federation models typically. Whereas in America and parts of India, obviously the IPL, there's private ownership models, franchise models. And that's been interesting to witness during COVID. So in the NBA, for instance, and the Major League Baseball, hockey as well, National Hockey League in the States, they're typically owned by billionaires. Very, very wealthy people own these teams. And most of those billionaires, some were under a bit of a pressure to do so, but some did it voluntarily, and most of them did it, stepped up during the COVID crisis and paid the players, paid the staff, paid the arena people, the cleaners of the stadiums, everyone, to get them through this crisis because they can, because they are very well resourced. Whereas some of the federation models, like we've seen in Australia, have not been resilient to this crisis at all financially. It's really hit us very hard in Australia across all professional sports. There is no doubt about that. Even cricket has been hit by this, and we thought they'd dodge the bullet, but they're doing it tough as well. So it's been, you know, I've witnessed firsthand some of the complexity of legal issues, contractual issues that are springing up during this crisis, and of course related to the significant financial hit sports are facing from the top down, the federation level down to the club level, and of course the grassroots level, and how to problem solve. So definitely a lot of people involved in sport, at whatever the occupation is, affiliated, whether you're an athlete, whether you're an administrator, whether you're a commercial executive, we're all learning a lot as we go, and I think that's a positive. That's really important IP to take forward, to remember how we've problem solved during this crisis and where the barriers have been and how we'll do it better next time. And more importantly, you know, what is the innovation we can apply to a post-COVID recovery going forward. So, you know, I think that's a really important part of it, but certainly trying to problem solve the complexity of those contracts and new legal issues that have arisen during this time. I remember when the pandemic was looking, I actually had returned from India, Shaun, you'll remember, with yourself as well, in early February. We'd taken a group of students over there to learn about sports law and governance, and we landed in mid-February. And I knew that, I thought, oh my goodness, I hope that the insurance covers the event insurance covers pandemic. And of course, a lot of the insurers have got exclusion clauses around COVID. So none of the sports were covered for that. So that was the first legal thing. And I know Jack and Dale and others will talk about this in a minute, but you know, so many complex things. Duty of care of your athletes has been stressful as well. I know most sports have had to stand down most of their staff to somehow keep afloat financially, and also try and stay in contact with them and the athletes, of course, during this time, and ensuring that there's the necessary welfare and relationships still being forged there. And you know, obviously sport, the culture of sport is so strong, as Matthew emphasized, it is like a family. So that is tough in itself. So there's, you know, trying to figure out virtual ways to ensure that you are discharging your duty of care to the people who run sport is another problem that has had to be resolved pretty quickly. And then the final thing that we're seeing in terms of the innovation piece and hope for recovery and business models around sport is the continued evolution and rapid growth of the athlete human brand online. I think that's been exciting to watch. Of course, in the States and some other jurisdictions, they recognize the right to personality and image and all these things. But because the athletes and sports haven't had a lot of marketing staff on board to do the usual collateral that you would do to engage fans and the community during season, the athletes, many of them have stepped up themselves and thought, well, here's my chance to help my sport and my club, but also my own personal brand. So I'm going to show the raw me. This is what I do. Here's my training schedule under the house with some rudimentary weights I've made yesterday. This is what life's like. We can only train in pairs. This is my best mate on the team, and there's a lot of banter. That in itself is super entertaining. It's super authentic from a marketing perspective, brand authenticity, sponsorship authenticity in activation is absolutely critical. And they've done it really well, just like that, in a really organic way. It is not under the club or sports direction. Many of these players have taken pay cuts to stay in the sport. So I think that's a wonderful evolution of sport overnight, literally around the world, to see athletes step up, to see not only how they can help their sports and the community as well around, you know, safe community practices like washing the hands, using their influence that way. But also I think that's a really positive way forward, this organic, authentic growth of the sport brand and human brand in sport. And then my final piece would be, who can forget, and I think in my office there at the background you can see it because I've always been a fan, the Michael Jordan documentary is a great example of what we will also see post-COVID a lot more of. And that is branded content around sport and sports identities. What a success story. ESPN being able to bring it forward to meet the void of sport during COVID. A fantastic marketing strategy in itself, huge success story. But that's an example of that authentic story being told around sports and a sports superstar. But you see the equivalent with Cricket Australia did the Test story, which is always a great story about the comeback, the great comeback post Sandpaper Gate. And we've seen it with, there was one I watched, Sunderland Till I Die, I think it is, the little known UK soccer team. Great story there as well. And I think this is a great opportunity for sport as a way to virtually engage and virtually activate. There were plenty of product placements in the Michael Jordan documentary. So it's a win-win. So that's probably enough from me, Shaun, but thank you so much for having me today.
No, thanks so much, Sarah, for that insight. It's you know, before we get into the legal side of things, it's really useful to have that business context, and also to appreciate that while this has hit the industry hard and you know, individuals hard, people have had to think on their feet and innovate, and in the longer term, these innovations might benefit sport and indeed improve the way we engage as fans in sport and consume sport. So, I mean, that's a really interesting perspective. And if you didn't mention Michael Jordan, I was going to, having noticed your background as well, because I think it's really interesting how production companies and franchises have, for example, with The Last Dance, kind of brought forward their release date because there's such a dearth of content in sport, and people are really craving their engagement with sport. So I think that's a really interesting case study. An interesting side note before we get to Jack, you mentioned holograms and technology. Last week during the India-Australia Virtual Summit, Prime Minister Scott Morrison actually praised Prime Minister Modi on his use of holograms in politics and rallies and promotions, given the wide audience that is there in India. So it's sort of interesting how this sort of innovation is used across sectors and whatnot. But I thought that was an interesting aside, given the bilateral talk as well. So thanks, Sarah. I'll now introduce you, Jack. And in particular, I'll just mention a few points. Jack is currently based in Melbourne as Director and Professor of the Sports Law Program at the University of Melbourne Law School. He was, for a period of time, Editor-in-Chief of the International Sports Law Journal, and is a prolific writer, has written numerous books on various issues in sports law, and innumerable. I can't even count the number of articles you've done on various issues in sports law, Jack. Apart from the writing and the publishing, Jack has been very involved both in terms of policy and dispute resolution, previously on the Court of Arbitration for Sport as an arbitrator, and also as an arbitrator in the international, or in the athletics dispute resolution tribunal, in hockey's integrity tribunal, and he was appointed more recently in the 2018 Commonwealth Games as the sole CAS arbitrator, actually, when they were based over here in Queensland. So I would ask you, please, Jack, to sort of, Sarah actually introduced quite conveniently some of the salient legal points that have arisen due to coronavirus. And if you could talk about how these, unique legal issues, Sarah mentioned duty of care, contractual issues, and a few others, if you could talk on them and what has really come to the front in terms of sports and law during coronavirus.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks to the organisers for this opportunity to speak, and thanks to the people who have signed up to it. I'm delighted to speak. Thanks especially to Ashutosh. We've had a long professional relationship, a lot of fun and laughs, and unfortunately, it's not been fun and laughs for sport over the last while. And it was great to hear Matthew Hayden. Normally, my kids studiously ignore everything I do, except that they saw that there was a Matthew Hayden on one of my emails, and my son uttered the words legend. I thought it was about me, but it wasn't. It was about Matthew Hayden. But he's been behaving ever since, which is good. So thanks to Matthew for that. Listen, this is all unexpected, totally unexpected. The last major sports event that I was at with my daughter was the cricket T20 World Cup between Australia and India, which is at the MCG. Now, unfortunately for India, Australia won very, very easily. But you just had to accept that Australia were very good on the day. But there was 85,000 people at it, and it was a magnificent event on International Women's Day. And yet, within a week in Melbourne, we had the first race in Formula One Grand Prix. Melbourne being the home of sport in Australia. Can I say that twice? Melbourne being the home of sport in Australia, just in case you didn't hear it up in Brisbane. But we have the Formula One Grand Prix, and it's shut down on the eve of the event because of the coronavirus. And during that week, the major US sports, the NBA in particular taking the lead, shut down. So very quickly we have that situation in March. And what we have very quickly, and Sarah outlined it as well, is very quickly the modern structure, financial structure that is behind sport is revealed to be gossamer thin. I mean, and that causes immediate problems, even for the richest sports in Australia and globally. And like, if you look at sports now, professional sports, I'm just talking about professional sports, roughly in Australia, now it's very rough figures, but about half their revenue comes from TV money, and the rest is sponsorship or gate receipts. And the gate receipts evaporate obviously immediately. The TV companies then begin to say, well, there's no sport on. If it comes back, it's going to be an abridged season. We have paid for something that cannot now be delivered. So you can talk about all the contractual issues you like in terms of force majeure or doctrine of frustration. But essentially what the TV companies were saying is, we paid for something. We're under a contractual obligation to provide money for that, but that cannot be provided now. And therefore we need to renegotiate. And that's what you saw. So here in Australia last night, the AFL, Australian football, begins again, and right at the last minute, they renegotiate a deal with the TV company in question. So that's interesting. And it's also interesting for the sponsors. And there's two things about the sponsors. The sponsors go, we're not getting value for money now because our brand is not there anymore, all right? It's an interesting contractual point. But it's also interesting. I support and I can hear you sniggering already, I support an AFL team called Carlton. Two of their major sponsors, Virgin Australia and La Trobe University, are in financial trouble. All right, they're in financial trouble. So therefore, it's not just that the sponsors are renegotiating contracts. It's the issue is whether or not they'll exist or have the money to come back into sport, which is an interesting point of view. And then from the legal point of view, when you're dealing with this, if you're the legal advisor within the sports body, well, the first thing you do, as Sarah exactly said, is do we have insurance? Virtually no major sports organization had relevant insurance, with the exception of Wimbledon tennis. Actually, they had pandemic insurance. Okay, it just happened, and a number of other tennis organizations did as well. But generally, no, we didn't. Then you look at the contract situation. But the interesting thing about the contract situation is there was a lot of talk about these issues of force majeure and can we pull out of these contracts. But actually, what we quickly saw in commercial things is there's a mutual benefit for the TV companies in sport. There's a mutual benefit for the sponsors in sport. So pulling out of them completely was not an issue. It was the renegotiation of that. And then when you renegotiate, you have to reorganize, and the prime example of that is the International Olympic Committee, with the Olympic Games being put back a year. And for me, from a legal point of view, what was interesting about that is there was a lot of talk about, we'd have to put it back a year. Who's going to pay for this? There was no issue who's going to pay for it. The Japanese organizing committee were going to pay for it. It's in the host city contract. It's right there, clause 60. Have a look. That's who has to pay for it, because that's what the IOC do contractually. And that's fair enough when it comes to major events like that. So there are some of the broader issues. And then if we dig down, and I'm just going to concentrate a little bit in Australia and then bring it back. If we look at the bigger sports here in Australia, look at the immediate impact it had on them. So both rugby codes, union and league, lose their CEO. So they lose their chief executive organization. An interesting point is, and we see it from sports like netball, but we see it in all codes. Immediately there is talk that the women's sport, almost as if it's some sort of separate code, is the one that's going to come under pressure in terms of cuts. Okay, and that's an interesting one to watch. Is it an excuse? So we look at AFL, AFLW, the season is not finished. But that's not the same with AFL where it comes back. So it's an interesting point about women's sport, which really was, as I said earlier in cricket, really coming on strong. So that's one to watch. The second thing to watch is the contract issues. So obviously I'm into football, proper football, soccer. And its key contractual date globally is the end of June. That's when contracts typically end. But now, because of COVID, the season has to be extended. But if my contract is due to end on June 30th, it's due to end on June 30th. And no amount of FIFA regulations can override that, because I have rights under national employment law. So that's been a really interesting one in terms of football contracts. Dale is going to speak a little bit about corruption. The interesting one is tennis, of course, where the vast majority of professional tennis players, the vast majority, do not make money from tennis. They are susceptible. They are vulnerable to match fixing approaches. And tennis is aware of that, and Dale will speak about that as well. And then with cricket, obviously, with Cricket Australia, we have this extraordinary situation with Cricket Australia, whereby despite a $1 billion TV deal, despite the fact that England have visited Australia recently, despite the fact that India has visited Australia recently, the CEO announced that by the end of August, if they did not cut back severely on staff, they would run out of money. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing. And you begin to ask questions about sports bodies and the reserves they have, in terms of cash and in terms of capital as well. And I think that's an interesting point as well. All right, and then kind of two further points, because I'm conscious of time, Shaun, but on the return to play, most sports just shut down and avail of whatever government's funding schemes that they can. The two interesting ones, Sarah has mentioned esports, which fills the void, which is an interesting one to watch, esports and that. The second one is, though, some sports survive, particularly those who are, and I say this as a fan of horse racing, but particularly those who are adjuncts of the gambling industry. Sports like horse racing basically don't need crowds. They are for gambling purposes, and that's straightforward enough. And they kept going. So that was an interesting one, and it was interesting to watch where the gambling money went on that. That's one. And then we have the return to play issues, and we have really interesting legal issues here, because first of all, we had an issue globally whereby players were put under pressure to return. In fact, they were asked at some stages to sign waivers or consent to returning. In other words, that if we put certain guidelines in and you still get the virus, well, we have a waiver in place. That's illegal under UK law, it's illegal under Australian law, it's illegal in most jurisdictions in terms of employment law. And players' associations struck that down almost immediately. That was an interesting point with regards to return to play. But other brief issues about return to play, and again, just focus a bit on Australia. Actually, what you saw in Australia is sport collectively working with government on a much better level. Traditionally, we work with government in terms of funding, give us more money. But this was, I think, a much better, whereby we plan our return to play in terms of developing protocols, etc. And they worked with Sports Australia and they worked with various bodies. So I thought that was quite a good point. And the last general point that I want to make is there is no doubt that sport will be changed by this. I spoke earlier about the 50-25-25 model of how things, TV money, etc. That may be the same, but there will be less money. And as Sarah rightly said, we have to come up therefore with more creative, innovative ways of locating revenue streams. Okay, one thing to watch, certainly from a player's point of view, which would be interesting in India with cricket as well. It's come from the US, whereby players now data is gathered on players all the time, in training, during games, GPA systems, etc. Basically, the clubs own that data, all right? But you will see in future agreements with players that they will want more access to that data to monetize it. And particularly when they go home and they rest and recuperate, you will see athletes beginning to gather their own data and try to monetize that. That'll be a really, really interesting one to watch in terms of that. But overall, the last point that I want to make is that most sports in India, in Australia, in the world over, they're organized on a pyramid basis, okay, like a pyramid. So at the bottom is the base, the grassroots, those of us who love and play the game. And right up to the top is the elite. And I think one thing that we've seen over the last couple of weeks and months is that maybe in many sports we put too much emphasis on the apex of the sport. And the primary duty of a sports body is to ensure that as many people as possible play the sport for as long as possible. That's their primary duty. And the emphasis on the elite, generating income from TV, etc., primarily going in expenditure to players, which, fair enough for players, has meant that we've put too much emphasis on the apex. And where you put too much emphasis and stress on the apex of a pyramid, you destabilize the pyramid as a whole. And I think that's what we need to realize. So that's it about from me. I'm happy to take questions later. I do think one last point is that there has been some issue about whether people at community level will return to sport as much as they have previously. I think there's no doubt they will. We are mad for it. We want to get back playing sport, and I think we will see that in the coming days ahead and weeks ahead. And I think it's more important now to know that sport matters, because in the broad sense of thing, it doesn't really matter at all. Thanks for that.
Thanks so much for that, Jack. And that sign-off point's really interesting, because for most discussions on such webinars, for most of our discussion as well, we've spoken about elite sport. We've spoken about professional sport and its impact, where certainly in an Australian context, grassroots sport and community sport is such a big thing. And it is around the world also. And what's interesting, and we've seen commentaries and discussions of this with concussion protocols, even, in your part of the world, or previous part of the world, if I can call it, and in Scotland as well, where they're talking about concussion and headbutting, basically, and headers of children, and putting the onus on coaches, so youth coaches, in making sure grassroots and community sports and the people who participate in it aren't harmed. So there's certainly flow-on effects, and one wonders on the impact on coaches and the people who are essentially volunteering their time and will have to implement some of these protocols at a grassroots level. So that's an interesting flow-on effect. Are we putting too much of a burden in some respects on these volunteers as well? But that's a separate conversation in and of itself, I think. And thank you for those insights. And by the way, Jack alluded to, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. Please send them to Dr. Ashutosh Misra or myself on the chat, and we will post a few of them for the speakers to consider, and we'll build in a little bit of time at the end to respond to those questions. I'll introduce now our final guest speaker, our distinguished speaker, Mr. Dale Sheehan, who's a retired Assistant Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mountain Police, and has had an illustrious international career, both for the RCPM, but also for United Nations peacekeeping forces internationally. He was Interpol's first Director of Police Training, and in fact, at Interpol, relevantly for our discussion, implemented Interpol's Integrity in Sport Directorate, and can talk a lot, therefore, about integrity issues for us today. He's also co-edited and authored a number of books, including a co-edited book on match fixing in football. Dale is currently the director of the International Centre of Sport Security, and he lectures all over the world on issues of integrity and corruption in sport. And we're delighted to have Dale here today to shed some light on some of these integrity issues that may span from, as Jack alluded to, match fixing to doping. There's some talk about ghost matches that may happen in times where there's not much sport being played. And I'll throw it over to you, Dale, to talk on some of these issues in the time that we've got.
And before to put in a footnote that Dale, the day Institute for Australia-India Engagement was launched, Dale had flown in to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Institute. And since then, we have had this relationship with Institute for International Center for Sport Security in Qatar. And many of the officials from ICSS are participating in this discussion. So we thank them, and we look forward to working with ICSS in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaun and Ash. It's my honor to be with such an esteemed panel. I must say, I think that each one of you deserve a panel in itself, in its entity. I could sit and listen to you forever. It's fascinating. I too do believe that sport is the very fabric of our community. And I can definitely agree with what Jack says and how that affects society and community. And like Sarah and Matthew, I do consider myself an optimist, but I'm an optimist that carries an umbrella. And I will take this in a little bit of a twisted manner in regards to this afternoon. I just did a little bit of Googling and a little bit of research at Interpol's latest Integrity in Sport newsletter to find out what's been going on in the last couple of weeks or during COVID in terms, it's two simple words, crime, sport. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to give you a couple of the headlines before I get into some of the other points. But around the world, 3 Sri Lankan cricketers are being probed for match fixing. In Brisbane, a greyhound racing trainer has been suspended for corruption and match fixing. Take what Jack says, it doesn't need fans to run that sport, but that doesn't stop a crime in sport. New South Wales, 2 arrests in national rugby. Football is starting in Europe post-COVID, and there's an investigation into a friendly match and match fixing, a friendly match. So some people might say, well, that doesn't really matter. It's a friendly match. Once people start betting money on something and the outcome is fixed, that's a crime. In terms of COVID with esports, where it's more virtual, and there has been an increase in bans of players and events in esports due to match fixing. The head of athletics of the world body is on trial for accepting millions of dollars to cover up Russian doping. And I could go on, but everybody's being very optimistic about this. So I'm going to try and do the same thing. The ICSS runs an international independent integrity sport hotline. And I can say that it's good news that we have not seen an increase in calls and cases that have come in during COVID. But I also have to say that we have not seen a decrease. In other words, nothing has changed. The cases are still coming in. The tendency is to see a shift from games that aren't being played. There is an increase in non-traditional sport crimes being reported, sports that never stopped, such as ping pong, esports. There's an increase in betting on ghost games. And as society is living without sport, I do think that in the over 350 cases that have been reported to the hotline, which is astronomical in itself, I believe, when you realize that most sports do have their own hotline as well. So there was some mention of tennis, and as part of Canada's funding recently, they gave $10,000 to $20,000 to all ranked tennis players in Canada, ranked between 100 and 750. And that's part of Canada's generous financial package that touched most of society. But one thing that it didn't recognize was that match fixing and corruption in sport, especially in tennis, there is a massive gap between the top ranked players and those at the bottom. And that was an opportunity to recognize that and exploit that. So there is an issue, like everywhere, like right throughout society, when athletes are not being paid, there is a risk. There is a risk, and this was an opportunity for sports during a downtime to really regroup and look at the integrity of their sport. And unfortunately, as Matthew, Sarah, and Jack have all spoke about, the business side of sport continued to remain the number one priority. What continues to be overlooked is the actual integrity portion of that. And I found it very interesting that as all of this was happening in COVID, I think it's important to note that organized crime and criminals don't self-isolate, and they don't practice social distancing. So they use this time during a global pandemic to recruit, to prey on the vulnerable, to hit up those athletes that are experiencing troubles or can't make payments. The business side that Sarah referred to, some NHL teams, some NBA teams. Some of them did pay all of their athletes, and some of them did pay and some didn't. And you're seeing sport the betting is dropping down tiers into high school sports, into anything that was not necessarily canceled or that had an opportunity to exploit. So there is a global pandemic in sport, and it's not the coronavirus, it's the crime that is happening in sport that I think that we really need to focus on. So on the business side that was referred to, they are looking at how do we cut the season, start the playoffs right away. At the end of the regular season in most sports in North America, the players don't get paid. The playoffs, they get paid for the regular season, and the playoffs, there is no pay. So the only ones that really truly benefit from a profit in the playoffs are the owners. And as Sarah correctly said, they're multi-billionaires. So what happens with some of these sports, like the NCAA, where they're not allowed to accept grants or funds, and they're a multi-billion-dollar sport with the inability to even recognize the athlete. So I think that was a dropped opportunity here. And Sarah, I am trying to remain optimistic, and I always will be. But I do think that sport did miss a perfect opportunity here to start to reflect on that. And I would suggest in the future and in the near future, with all of these, this expertise across the board, the issue of racism in sport is another topic that is at the forefront of importance. So from my perspective, it's short and sweet, and that is the prevention and education. And we were recently received a call on a case of bullying and harassment in minor hockey in Canada. All of the parents were aware of it. Half of the parents agreed, half of the parents didn't agree. Most of the parents didn't want to speak up because they were afraid that the repercussions would mean a cut of ice time. It would mean perhaps my son wouldn't get on the team next year. And those are the things that we have to overcome in sport in terms of making it the fundamental fabric of our society. So when the important part of what I believe in what everybody is saying is it's absolutely understandable. The business of sport is an entity that everybody is aware of. And every segment of society right now is hurting. But if you found out that Matthew scored, I think you said 514 runs, excuse me if I have the number wrong, or if we found out that someone scored a winning goal in the Stanley Cup, or a wicket in cricket, or whatever the sport might be, a la Ben Johnson in Canada when he won the gold medal and was shortly disqualified after for doping, that's where the very fabric of society starts to crumble, because it's our youth and the role models that they look to for something that's inspirational. And when they see cheating and gambling and doping and sexual assaults, there is an issue of integrity that we have to continue to strive for. So I thank you very much for your time. I am an optimist, Sarah, and I promise I will continue to fight for the good side of sport. But I also do think that every once in a while I have to open my umbrella. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale, for those insights. And it's glad to know that it's not all doom and gloom, but there's certainly opportunities for improvement. And education, it's often said, is central to that. So hopefully it's not a missed opportunity in the broadest of senses, and hopefully some reflection has taken place. And perhaps the policymakers and future policymakers on this call can take note of that opportunity to promote reform and prevention and education to make sport cleaner and better for everyone as well. So thanks, Dale. And I'm sure as a result of all the insight you and Jack and Sarah and Matthew have provided all of us, that there are a number of questions from those on this call. And in fact, I have shared a few of them on the chat. I understand that you don't all have access to share your comments with everyone, but certainly Ashutosh and I do. So if you have any questions, shoot them across to us, and the panelists can have a quick read of them. But we'll also, we'll give them a chance to answer the ones targeted at them, specifically. But Ash and I will read them out as well. Read a selective number of them out. So I think there's a few to each of you. Dale, not to you yet, but I've got many for you if no one else asks. So there's no issue there. But in the interest of time, we'll keep this only for about, I think, 10, 15 minutes maximum, because we do have to wrap up. So I don't know if you guys have had the opportunity, Jack or Sarah, to read some of those questions, but I might tackle it in order of, who spoke. Sarah, have you had a chance to look at it?
There's one from Mr. Deep Sarkar, and which is to Matthew Hayden. Matthew, how do you see the role of Cricket Australia, BCCI, and England Cricket Board in expanding the base of cricket, which ICC proposes to do?
Ash, is Matthew still on the call? Because that might save us some time. I'm not sure. I think he had to step out for a moment after just a short time ago.
We'll get back to that then. And Lakshit, Sarah, did you get some of the questions which Shaun may have forwarded from Lakshit Sharma? Will e-sport be more structured now?
Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, we might just ask the panelists to almost abbreviate the question and answer it. It might.
So, and there were two more to you, Sarah. So one I read already. Other one is from Virup, which says, now people going back to office, do you think now they will have less time to watch TV? So is it going to impede TV revenues? And the third one is from Akash to Sarah. Do you expect the buzz to be the same in NBA as they look to kickstart their season? And yes.
Shall I answer those really quickly?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the last one first, the buzz and excitement, the atmosphere at live sport, especially NBA, is so good at that traditionally. Look, it's going to be really, really different basically until there's some sort of vaccine or some sort of immunity passport or something, some solution to reducing the social distancing. It will be different. But as I said, I think there's a lot of innovations currently happening. I'd love to have shares in a fake crowd, company, because they're doing very, very well. They're getting better as we speak. The jury's out a bit on the AFL first game last night. I see on the social media some fans loved it, some weren't sure. I personally think it created a lot more atmosphere than the first round of games that was just silent. It was all very strange. So yeah, I think we're just going to see a lot more innovations there happening to create that buzz with which we're so familiar. Not sure about the cardboard cutout fans. I think we can do better there. Maybe some holograms happening there. The other question was, what was that about? Will people watch sport now that they're busier or back at work? I actually personally, and I think talking to you earlier, Jack and Dale and Shaun, Ash, we have been busier than I've ever been in my whole working life during COVID. So I will be relieved to go back to some sort of normal work where there are breaks between meetings. There's a coffee here and there that's a bit more relaxing. And look, I think, as we've all said today, sport is a universal connector. It's a universal language. We've seen through the branded content piece I spoke about earlier, appetite for sports content is insatiable. So I don't think it will affect anything in terms of whether we'll watch sport or not. I think it might even increase it because we've missed it so much. I would never have watched a Collingwood-Richmond game, but I did last night because I was so excited to see live sport back.
Thanks, Sarah. I think, Jack, there's one or two questions for you. I mean, even if you yourself want to just paraphrase them and answer them.
Deep Sarkar asked you, Jack, that how important is it for India to have an act to legislate horse racing? And the other one is from Aviru, that some contracts do not have the force majeure clauses. How do clubs and athletes defend themselves?
Yeah. So on the last one, the contract ones, that's a really interesting question on the contract issue with regard to force majeure clauses. What you find is that actually it's the mutual benefit principle that they renegotiate the contract in the absence. And one thing that we have found with players is that with the return to play issue, employers, as in clubs, have suddenly realized that actually the stadium, the training area, is a place of work, and therefore occupational health and safety applies there, and that sport does not have an exemption. So that's been a really interesting learning curve. Everyone knew that, but it's really started to apply now. So that's the contract issue. The issue with regard to horse racing, one of the things you find with horse racing is, particularly in the common law world of which India is a part of, is that most sports are let self-regulate with kind of loose recognition criteria, except horse racing, which tends to be on a statutory basis. The reason for that is the links with gambling. And therefore you need to regulate that relationship because it has implications for tax revenue, potentially money laundering, etc. So that's an interesting one. There is one question on the thing as well about football in Australia, soccer having so many kids playing, etc. on that. That's from Christopher Parker. Just very briefly to answer that question. Two things about soccer, football in Australia. It's very expensive, actually, at youth level. But it goes to my general point that I made as well. Here in Victoria, 2 out of 3 kids, as they enter the teenage years, 2 out of 3 kids play an organised sport. By the time they leave the teenage years, it's down to 1 out of 3. And actually, for female participants, it's less. We still haven't answered that question properly.
I think if I can just add to that, Jack, in India, actually, it's horse racing where gambling is actually regulated. And,
yeah.
1888 Police Act and Game Act 1930.
Yeah, it has been for a long time. Yeah.
Yes. And to Dale, there is a question from Aviru asking you now that athletes are at home and during lockdown times and they are not having the access to regular diets and eating all kinds of stuff, including junk. So do you think that creates a problem with WADA regulations or something?
Well, that's an excellent question. So to my knowledge, given the COVID, WADA has actually stopped doping tests during this time. So again, they're going to try their best in very difficult circumstances to enforce this, but the opportunity right now for athletes to develop up or to cheat through doping prior to sports starting again and being clean with 2 weeks notice is absolutely a possibility. And I do think that that's one of the things that in post-COVID that we have to look at is how do you continue the integrity programs that currently exist when in fact it was impossible for WADA to continue. It's a very good question.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting point. And I know a couple of jurisdictions have tried so-called virtual testing where they send sample kits and literally watch people provide that sample in the requisite material and seal it and send it back. But perhaps is that the only way to do things during lockdowns and where social distancing is mandatory? I mean, it does beg a lot of questions and makes one think from an integrity perspective whether people will attempt to flout the system, as you've alluded to, across all integrity, including doping issues. So thanks for that answer, Dale. I've got a question which probably Sarah and Jack can answer, since there's a lot of students on the call that might be relevant to a number of them. They've said, how does the COVID-19 era or the circumstances around higher education, how will that impact a student's chances or processes of applying for and undertaking study in sports law or other sports subjects internationally?
Jack, do you want to go first on that one?
No, I think you go first on that one, Sarah.
Oh, look, it's yeah. So obviously, there's most countries' borders are still closed. So all of us, the future is uncertain in terms of when national borders will be opened. We don't know here in Australia yet. I don't think they're talking about having safe student corridors open up in Australia, and there's a couple of pilots about to start into a couple of states, not to Queensland and Victoria, Jack. I don't think they're opening up yet, those corridors. I think it's South Australia and somewhere else. So they're testing those out, and then maybe by late this year, they'd look at that. But that being said, the universities, even the face-to-face universities like Jack and I teach at, have really, I hate using this word because it's so hackneyed now, but we've pivoted into online learning very, very well. And so you can still access it online.
Anything to add, Jack?
Yeah, no, if anything, because we've kind of moved more into online, the thing about sports law is that it's quite global in some, you know, so anti-doping law applies generally, match fixing issues generally. So we, particularly with Australia, because of our time zone, relatively speaking, to Asia is quite good. You know, there's certainly opportunities there. I mean, there's no question about that. Listen, in terms of career entry, it's tough. It is a tough market at present. One of the things that we probably haven't picked up on is that a huge amount of sports administrators and the back team, if you like, coaches, etc., have been laid off. Including in-house lawyers as well. But having said that, and we've had previous experience in terms of recessions before, certainly when you're from Ireland, you have plenty of experience of recessions, that it's a chance to upskill. And sports law is a very innovative, creative area, and there's a lot going on in this space. The things that I mentioned with regard to data, the things with match fixing, the things with looking ahead in terms of contracts and commercial development. There's a lot there to think about. And there's a lot there to make yourself useful, that's awful phrase, for sports bodies. So this is a chance to think about it.
Perfect. And maybe two very quick points and questions Dale or anyone else might want to answer. And that is, one is on mental health, which is a critical issue in sport generally, but particularly during these coronavirus times, and what can be done and what is being done to ensure that, you know, elite athletes, fringe players, or even amateur athletes are not suffering from, you know, depression or other diagnosable illnesses or simple, you know, just mental health issues, which may be going unnoticed. And second, in terms of regulation, we've talked about education, but around match fixing and other integrity issues, regulation and essentially drafting laws with respect to match fixing, for instance, or even legalizing gambling. In a country like India, there's certainly loopholes in terms of, you know, gambling has a blanket ban. Does that create more issues than it doesn't for things like match fixing and other integrity issues? And second, should there be a law against match fixing specifically? We know in an Indian context, there are loopholes when someone tries to prosecute or charge an athlete for match fixing, because it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole under the Indian Penal Code. So maybe Dale, you first, and then if anyone else would like to comment.
I mean, I think a very valid point that in terms of your mental health part, I agree with Sarah. I think it has been a refreshing time to see some of the behind the scenes stories of sports and what people have overcome. I watched the Lindsey Vonn show the other day on downhill skiing and what she accomplished and how she did it. That's the inspirational part of sport that I think is contagious and excellent for youth. And in terms of the athletes themselves, they're, like all of society, mental health is such a massive issue on how to cope and how to deal with it. And I do think every entity of society is going to learn how to come out of this and do things differently in the future. To your question to your students or the students on sport and the future of sport, my only suggestion is look at the future and what is it going to be like? How do you ensure integrity in sport in doping? What is the innovative way that things need to be done in the future? And I think that that's a segment of sport that is wide open for the future. And finally, in regards to match fixing, absolutely. I mean, gambling was just legalized in the United States, and I was at a hockey game in New Jersey, and there's an actual betting lounge above the hockey rink in January. And as a player's going down the ice on a breakaway, they're announcing the odds to bet on from your seat. So you can see now, it's not necessarily match fixing. That's a lot of the approach that organized crime is using is not to affect the outcome of a game, because that's where an athlete, even if they're slightly corrupt, will take offense at that. But what they will say is, I'll give you $50,000 that the first time you touch the football, you kick it out of bounds. Or I'll give you $75,000 if you get the first yellow flag of the match. And that creates the athlete's perception that, well, that's not really affecting the outcome of the game. But once you're in that system, then it becomes the bribery and the threatening. So I think Canada, for example, you have to bet on 3 games in a sport. There's no single sport betting. So if I don't want to bet on the other 2 games and I only want to bet on Montreal versus Toronto, I'm going to go the illegal betting route. It's easy, it's online, and I can do it. So the laws are archaic and outdated. And I think that's part of the thing that every country has to look at. And part of the international working groups like the ICSS, like Interpol, it really takes government buy-in and the athletes themselves to speak out.
Thanks for that, Dale. Unless Jack or Sarah have anything to add on any of those points, I'll hand it over to Ash.
No, the only thing I would say is Michael Jordan documentary is superb. If you want to have a really good sports law documentary, look at Lance Armstrong's 30 for 30. If you want to know how someone can justify what they did because everyone else was doing it, if you want to see a sport that has been riven by integrity issues and think about a sport, what's dealing with it now, look at cycling, look at Armstrong and listen to what he says. Forget, most of it is waffle, self-justification, but listen to what he says about Floyd Landis. Listen to that and you'll really see what happened. And so for sports law students, that's a great one to watch, as well as Jordan, of course. Yeah, that's all.
And
Thank you.
Shaun, I just wanted to add one last thing, and Ash, the mental illness thing, like concussion as well, I think they're just Goliaths. They were really important before COVID. I think COVID has made them a lot worse. I know the sports workplaces as well are seeing spikes in mental illness issues. Something worth watching really closely. You know, and when Jack's mentioned women's sport, I think semi-professional and grassroots sports people are particularly vulnerable given what has happened, where they can't even go and access their sport. Yeah. My son is a local grassroots AFL player. He's just returned from the United States, where his NCAA senior season was demolished. Very first world problems, but sad for them. He's reconnected with all these young blokes at the local AFL footy club. Most of those guys who are aged between 18 and 23 and described as a vulnerable group for mental illness have lost their jobs, or they've finished university and they can't get jobs. That was the conversation he had with them last night, but he was so happy to connect with them and have a forum where they can all chat. And so that's the role sport is playing. It's really important we keep connected with sports people, whether virtually or face-to-face, to monitor this.
Well said.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Shaun, Jack, and Dale. I've got a message that because of the technical glitch, Matthew is not being able to rejoin us, so apologies there. But ladies and gentlemen, it's been a very fascinating day. And you can see from the quality of presentations and discussion and comments that have been coming in, that has been transpired over the course of the discussion today. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is the second of the Triveni Dialogue series. So it's my profound pleasure to bring in the third stream of the Tri-Junction, as we call it, the Triveni Dialogue understanding, is the Australia-India Business Council. It is my profound pleasure to welcome Dr. Nick Senapati, who was elected president of the Australia-India Business Council in Queensland in September 2016. Until 2015, Nick was country head of Rio Tinto in India, a role that he held for almost 10 years. Nick is a geologist and has spent over 35 years in the mining industry with roles in exploration, operations, strategy, and external relations. Nick is also currently an honorary chairman of FICCI, Australia. He has chaired mining committee of the Confederation of Indian Industry and was instrumental in establishing Sustainable Mining Initiative for the Indian mining industry and initiated the Skills Council in the mining sector. Nick was educated in India, Australia, and as a Rhodes Scholar in the UK. And he holds a PhD from the University of Wollongong. It's a profound pleasure to welcome Dr. Nick Senapati to kindly deliver the vote of thanks and also his closing remarks. Nick, all yours. Thank you.
Sorry, am I on now?
Yes, yes, you are.
So thank you all very much. And on behalf of the AIBC, which is a 30-year-old organization or 30-year plus organization, we're very pleased to be part of this, series of talks. But we'd also like to emphasize that our main focus is about promoting trade between Australia and India. And there was a strategy done by Peter Varghese about 18 months ago, which is the strategy to 2035 between what Australia should do with trade with India. And one of the areas was sport as being an important component of that. There were 9 other sectors, but sport was one of the 10 sectors that was picked out as being important. And there were 10 states in India that those sectors should focus on. And that's if those who are doing trade between the two countries, that's an interesting report to read. Definitely the executive summary of it, because it's quite a big, thick document. Thank you to the esteemed people, Matthew, who's not on anymore, Sarah, Jack, and Dale. Thank you very much for your views. As Dale said, we could have had a webinar based on each of these speakers in themselves. It was fascinating. They covered a huge array of subjects. And from my personal point of view, having played a bit of international sport in my time, there've always been impacts of global events that have affected sport in some way. And then they've mainly been political. This is really the first, apart from the Olympics last year had a bit of a virus scare with Zika virus coming in. But this is, I think, this is the first time in where sport is so global that we've had a health scare, and it's impacted everything. And I think it'll be quite different. Sport will be quite different coming out of this than it is at the moment. Yeah? And having played a bit of international sport, but at the amateur level, I think I'm very Jack's comments on the importance of the grassroots sport. I fully support, and especially in continuing to have the culture of sport and the enthusiasm that creates, and the fact that it is sport at the grassroots level that in fact creates the characters of people. Elite sport is something that you may want to aim to, but it is the sport that you play at the amateur level as kids and as young adults that actually teach the interaction between people and the ethics of interaction. And I think we have to continue to emphasize that aspect of it. Yeah. So I won't take any more time. I'll just say thank you very much. I'm very pleased. As AIBC, we're very pleased to be part of this these series. And thank you very much, Ashutosh.
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you, Nick. You can wrap up the meeting now, Shaun, if you want to now.
All right. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Stay safe, and please look out for our future notices. Thank you all for joining us from all over the world. Thank you.